Hello everyone! In today's video, I'm going to help you figure out the best way to navigate a city. My name is Heather. This channel is Heather Travels. I have been traveling my whole life, and most of the traveling I've done has involved me planning the travel for my family. I'm a single mom of 3 basically adult kids at this point. I've been traveling with them. I traveled solo before I had kids. I traveled with my dad when I was a kid, and I've done most of the planning throughout my life and have a wealth of travel knowledge. The purpose of this channel is to help you have better travel experiences. If that's something that interests you, I really encourage you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of my upcoming videos. Alright, the idea for today's video came off of the tail end of the little series of vlogs that I just finished, which was a short series of a weekend getaway that my daughter and I took in the Twin Cities in Minnesota, which is St. Paul and Minneapolis. And I had some thoughts about some of the things in those videos, because in those videos, we got around the Twin Cities and we talked about a lot of different forms of transportation. We started at the airport because I went to pick Megan up there, but she had taken a bus from college to the airport. So at the airport, obviously, you'd be talking about airplanes. We talk about trams. We talk about a light rail system. We talk about taxis. We talk about rental cars. I was driving my own car. So there's a lot of different forms of transportation that you can be considering when you're visiting a city. Most of the traveling that people do, honestly, is probably visiting a city for at least part of or all of their trip. The second part of why I decided to do this video is a question that I got from a viewer. Now, the question was posted in a comment on, I'm not sure which video it was, but it was when we were visiting Seattle last June. We had just gotten off a Holland America cruise to Alaska. I'll put the playlist for that up here if you want to go back and review it. And we spent a few days in Seattle exploring the city of Seattle after our cruise. The viewer asked in the comment, do you think that getting around, and I'm assuming they meant Seattle, but I'm not sure, by taxi or walking or Uber or Lyft or, you know, how did I feel was the best way to get around? And again, I think they were referring to Seattle. I did respond to their comment in regards to what I felt was true for Seattle. But in this video, I want to give you kind of an overview of visiting any city. I have lived in Europe twice, and there are a couple of differences, some general differences I can tell you about cities in Europe and cities in the United States. Because the vast majority of my viewers are Americans or based in the United States, I'm going to focus this video mainly on the United States because the United States is actually a little bit unusual and unique to a lot of different parts of the world. And the United States is also very large and vast and has a lot of variety within its cities. I have been to almost every major city in the United States, most of them multiple times. So if you have a specific city that you are wondering about what the best way to get around is, leave it in the comments below and I will answer your questions about that particular city if I don't already mention it in this video. Okay, so the first thing I want to say is I want to give a little bit of a comparison for some general aspects of transportation between the United States and Europe. Okay, because if you're visiting Europe, that's a whole other thing. And I actually have a whole playlist from when we spent almost the entire month of August 2022 in Europe. We took a lot of different forms of transportation there, and I will leave that playlist at the end of this video so that you can watch that if you want to. But in general, there's 2 main things I want you to know about the differences between traveling around a city in Europe and traveling around a city in the United States. The first one is pretty much every city in Europe, and I would also say Japan, and then there's going to be other ones scattered throughout the rest of the world too, is going to have a far superior public transportation infrastructure in place than any city in the United States. Public transportation is far more advanced, cleaner, safer, more efficient, more modern. They're just much more used to using public transportation in other parts of the world, and especially in Europe and especially in Western Europe, than they are anywhere in the United States. So if you are traveling to a city in Europe, my number one recommendation to you is always going to be to use public transportation. That is going to be the most efficient, fastest way to get around in any European city that you're visiting without hesitation. If you've ever been to a city in the United States trying to get around, I mean, even New York City, and then you've been to a city in Europe and seen the difference, it's just like night and day. We just don't have the advancement in the United States in public transportation infrastructure that they have in Europe. The same goes for like rail travel in general. The difference between rail travel in most European countries, you know, travel from city to city and country to country, is far superior to the infrastructure that Amtrak has here in the United States. They're trying all the time to improve rail and to improve public transportation in cities in the United States, but it's very slow. And again, the United States is massive. I don't know that we will ever have a smooth, high quality, high speed rail infrastructure in the United States like they have in Europe. I mean, it would be so unbelievably expensive. I don't know that that will ever happen. Okay, so just know that if you're traveling to Europe, if you're traveling to Japan, and then there's going to be like some other places in the world too, your first thought should be, I should use public transportation, because that's going to be the best way to go in most cases. The other thing that I want to tell you about differences in transportation methods between the United States and Europe is the terminology might vary. Now, this can even vary between cities within the United States. So for example, what I mean by this is what we call something here where I live in the upper Midwest might be a completely different term than they would use on the West Coast or the East Coast or the South. The type of things I'm referring to are like train, tram, light rail, gondola, elevated rail, subway. All of those kind of words might not mean what you think it means in the place that you're visiting. Let's take the word subway, for example. For us in the United States, when we think of the word subway, we think of an underground rail system within a city. So for example, the New York City subway system, okay? Trains underground, although a lot of the New York City's subway system is also above ground, but trains that you use to get around the 5 boroughs of New York City, okay? In Europe, a subway has nothing to do with trains. Sub comes from, you know, the word that means below. So a subway is a way to get below. So in Europe, what you're going to see when you hear the word subway is a pedestrian crossway, a pedestrian tunnel, if you will, like under a road to get from one side of the highway to the other, for example, by foot. That's a subway. It's a way under is all it is. When you say, can you tell me where the subway is? They're going to think you're looking for some kind of way to cross a busy highway on foot. They don't think that you're looking for a train. Okay, so you're going to want to use probably metro in most places. In Washington, D.C., the subway system is referred to as the metro. In Paris, the subway system is referred to as the Perimetro. London, for example, it's referred to as the underground or the tube. Now, those actually are technically different things, but it's all one system. So if you say the underground or the tube in London, they're going to know what you're talking about. You're looking for the trains that go underneath the ground. If you're not sure what someone is saying or what your directions are telling you, when you look up how to get somewhere and you're using public transportation and it's saying take this train or take this tram or take this whatever the word is, ask somebody. What is this exactly, so you know what to expect and you know what you're looking for. Because if you think you're looking for one thing and it's actually something completely different, you need to know that in advance. So even between cities in the United States, what they call a trolley in one city might be something completely different in a different city. So you want to make sure that you're understanding what the form of transportation is that you're looking for. Now, a couple things that I think are probably a given anywhere is a car. Okay, an automobile or a car is going to be the same everywhere. A taxi is going to mean the same thing everywhere. It's going to mean a licensed taxi service with a meter that's going to work the same in pretty much any city that you visit generally, okay? Different cities, again, will have different ways of regulating their taxi services, but for the most part, it's going to be a traditional taxi service where you're charged, you know, a certain amount to go a certain distance. When we went to Seattle last year, my dad was unfamiliar, had no experience using a ride share. So this would be like Uber, Lyft, or other things like that. There's other ones in other cities and countries. Ride share is where you are using an app on your phone to summon, if you will, a ride share vehicle. Now, in my personal experience, somebody tell me, have you ever actually had to share a ride share car with anybody? I never have, but that's usually because I'm using a ride share in a group of people already anyway. So there's 3, 4, 5 of us together and we all need to go in one car. So they're not going to have room for anybody else. And so I've never in my own personal experience seen a rideshare pick up anyone else when they're driving me around. But if you have, let me know where that was and what was the circumstances, because I'm just curious. I just feel like maybe their initial use of the word rideshare has evolved over time, and it's really more like kind of a private taxi service, if you know what I mean. They're driving around or waiting somewhere all the time. They're going to see that there's customer waiting. They get to choose if they want to pick you up. And they will get to choose that based on, do I want to go that direction? Do I want to go that far? Do I want to take that many people? Does this person have a rating that's acceptable to me? Remember, your driver rates you just like you rate your driver at the end of a ride. If you threw up in their car or you were really rude to them or whatever, they might give you a very good rating as a passenger, and that might make it more difficult for you to get rideshare rides in the future. Other things that are not going to change. A bus is a bus. A bicycle is a bicycle. Some cities might have regular bicycles that you can rent or borrow from your hotel, for example. And then increasingly, many cities are now offering electric bikes or e-bikes that you can rent. Again, it's going to be using some kind of app on your phone or something like that to pay for that. And then you'll be able to return it somewhere else if you want to. Foot or walking. That's never going to change. In a lot of cases, when you're visiting a city, walking is probably your best bet. Now that we've covered that general terminology and kind of are all on the same page, I'm going to divide the rest of this video and everything I talk about into 4 main ways to get around any city. Okay, so the 4 main ways that you can get around in a city are in a car that you are driving. So that could be your own car that you drove all the way from home, or it could be a rental car. You know, maybe you rented a car from a car rental agency at the airport or the Amtrak station when you got there or whatever it was. Okay, so you either have your own car or a rental car. That's option 1, is driving yourself. Option 2 is somebody else is driving you. So that's where we go to taxis, Lyft, Uber, any other kind of rideshare app service. Okay, so somebody else is driving you and you're getting around on a series of individual rides that you pay for. Okay, that's the second option. The third option is public transportation. Public transportation in different cities can involve a lot of different means of transportation. It can involve a subway or a metro. It can involve buses, and often will. It can involve a trolley, a tram, a boat. It could involve, you know, a water taxi, a ferry. Lots of different things will go in that category of public transportation. And almost every major city in the world is going to have some form of public transportation. Larger cities are going to have multiple methods for you to get around on public transportation. It could be some combination of a trolley, a tram, a train, a bus, a boat, you know, like that. The fourth and final option for how you can get around in any city is your own 2 feet. Some cities are much more walkable than others. What we mean by walkable when we say that is it's easy to navigate on your own 2 feet. It's safe and it's kind of meant for walking. And what I mean by that is, like, are there sidewalks? You know, we're not going to ever recommend to you that you walk around a city on the side of a freeway, you know, or something like that. Or if there's no sidewalks, there needs to be some kind of pedestrian infrastructure in place so that you can walk from place to place. Now, in many cities, certain parts of the city might be very walkable, but others, especially as you get farther out into the outskirts of a city or into the suburbs, then it's going to be less so. So depending on what you want to visit in a city, you might be able to do certain areas of the city on your feet, but in other areas, you're going to have to use one of the other three methods of transportation. So either driving, somebody else driving you around, or public transportation. There's going to be two aspects to transportation when you're visiting a city. The first aspect is how do you get to and from the city itself? So for example, I'm going to be flying to Boston, someplace that I go quite frequently because my son lives out there, okay? So I fly from Minneapolis to Boston. I have in the past, before my son lived out there, also taken Amtrak from here generally to Boston. So I've done both of those. So that's an example of a city that I could get to several ways. I could arrive in Boston by airplane. I could arrive in Boston by train. I could arrive in Boston in my own car. I could even arrive in Boston on a ship. So how you're going to arrive to any particular city is the first thing that you're going to want to consider. And I have a whole series of videos on my channel about air travel, for example, and I try to show as much of airports as I can. I have a whole detailed playlist or series of videos on my channel about the Minneapolis airport because that's my home airport and it's a big airport. And I try to show airports when we travel in and out of places because that's a pretty common way that people are going to be arriving in cities. And like I try to show things like this is where you go to pick up your rental car, or this is where you're going to go if you need to get public transportation, you know, or you need to get into the city center or whatever it is. So I try to point those things out when we travel so that I have videos on my channel. I have almost 800 videos on my channel, folks. If you haven't gone back and watched these, there's so much good information on my channel. If there's some place you're planning on visiting, coming up in April here, check out my homepage. I switch up the playlists that I feature on my homepage on my YouTube channel every month. Here in March, I have been featuring the last 4 or 5 years of trips that we took in March. So it was specific to the month. In April, I'm planning on featuring different cities that you might visit. So some of the cities that I might put on there are, because we've been to them recently, Seattle, Boston, Los Angeles, New Orleans, Chicago. Go to my homepage and look for the little magnifying glass and put in what you're interested in it, and it'll search just within my channel for that topic. If it's something you're wondering about with travel, I've probably already made a video about it. So make sure you're not missing those. And please, again, be sure to subscribe. And while you're down there, give me a thumbs up. One factor that you need to consider is how are you getting to the city? How are you arriving to the city and how are you departing from the city? That's the first thing you've got to take care of. If you need to pick up a rental car or you need to get a ride or you need to figure out how to get public transportation, because probably the next place that you're going is your accommodation. You're probably arriving in the city and then you need to get to where you're staying. So you need to figure that part out first, because that might be different than how you get around the rest of the time. Okay, so you might arrive by train and then take public transportation to your hotel, but then the rest of the time you're going to be walking and using taxis or something like that. So that's the one aspect. And then the second aspect of exploring or visiting a city is how you're going to get from place to place. How are you going to get to the attractions, the museums, the restaurants, the shows, whatever it is you're doing in that city? How are you going to get there from basically your hotel or wherever you're staying, or from one place to the other? So we're going to this museum in the morning, but in the afternoon, we're going to this show at this theater. How do we get from here to here? For the first part, where you're arriving in a city, that's where I would suggest that you do a little research on your own and use the means of transportation you're going to use or the management of the hotel to your advantage. So for example, if you're flying into a place and you need to get to your hotel, ask your hotel, call them and ask them specifically, what's the best way for me to get to you from the airport? Because they're going to know. Or if you know that you need to rent a car, do a little research ahead of time of that airport terminal and find where the rental cars are. I mean, usually there's going to be good signage in the airport and you'll be able to figure it out. But, you know, just know in advance, oh, okay, the rental cars are going to be over here. And then ask your rental car person when you leave or when you're getting your car, or even the person at the gate. I mean, sometimes the rental car experience now is completely contactless. In Florida and Orlando, you pick your own car. You go down there and you just pick the car you want, get in it and drive away. And then they just stop you at the gate, like to check your license and stuff. So you ask that person at the gate, how do I get out of here and get to Disney World? You know, you at least need to know what general direction to start driving, and they'll be able to tell you that. So that's the first thing you got to figure out, is you got to have a good sense in mind. I can't tell you how many people I see so confused pulling over to the side of the road when they rent a car right away because they have absolutely no idea where they're going. Or, you know, wandering around the airport trying to figure out how to get to, what do I do now? You know, they have no idea what to do. So you need to do a little research ahead of time. You can't just get off the plane or get off the train with all your luggage and have no idea where you're going. So that's very important first, to figure out how to get out of the initial arrival point, okay? Now, if you're driving yourself to this city from home, for example, in your own car, that's just going to be a matter of following directions to the place that you're going, you know, to the hotel or whatever it is. So that's not going to be that bad, but you do want to factor in traffic. Traffic is the biggest enemy to driving in a city, especially an unfamiliar city. And I would add in that for a good number of months of the year, you also are going to need to factor in construction. Okay, construction can really mess people up when they try to drive themselves to a city that they're visiting. So construction and traffic can really make things very stressful and very difficult, and is one of the reasons I do not actually recommend driving your own car when you visit most cities. The second part of your travel to a city is going to involve getting around the city itself once you're there. So basically going, like I said, from your hotel to different places or from one place to the other. There are two apps that I recommend. Number one is obviously the one most people go to is Google Maps, okay? Google Maps is great. It gives you how long it takes you. It gives you very detailed. It'll give you step-by-step directions. You can even have it talk to you. I've done that. You can put a headphone, you know, an earbud in your ear and have it be telling you, okay, now turn left, now, you know, and stuff like that. Or have somebody else reading it for you when you're driving or whatever. Google Maps is great and usually pretty accurate. However, Google Maps has one inherent flaw, in that you have to choose what method of transportation you're using. Are you walking there? Are you using public transportation? Are you taking a bike? Or are you driving? And it won't combine them, as far as I know. If there's a way to combine them that somebody knows, let me know in the comments. But as far as I know, you have to choose just one method of transportation with Google Maps, and it's going to take you the whole way by foot or by car, but you can't do both, all right? So if you know that you suspect that you're going to need to use multiple forms of transportation to get to a place, or you just have no clue and don't know where to begin, the other app that I recommend is Roam 2, the number 2, Rio, R-I-O, like Rio de Janeiro, okay? It's also a website, which is great. I really like to use Roam to Rio before we go on a trip at home on my desktop computer to get a general sense of how am I going to get there and how long is that going to take and what methods of transportation am I going to use. And it combines methods of transportation. It'll tell you, okay, you're going to need to take the blue line to this station, and then you're going to have to get off and get on the number 14 bus. And then you're going to get off the bus and you're going to walk left for this far. It'll be that specific. The other thing Rome to Rio does that I really, really like is it gives you options. Option 1 is this. Option 2 is this. Option 3 is this. And it will also tell you, it's kind of like kayak in this way, it'll tell you the fastest. It'll tell you the cheapest. So if you want to see, okay, I have 5 options to get to this place. This one's the fastest, but it's going to cost me like $100. But this one is the cheapest, but it's going to take me 2 hours. Okay, so you can kind of balance, and there'll be some options in between that will combine them to give you a more reasonable choice. So I really like the app Rome to Rio for that because it will give you options. And sometimes I am picking an option. I'm like, okay, well, we can either do this or we could do this. What do you guys want to do? You know, what do they feel like? How do I feel right now? How hot is it outside? How much money do I have? You know, how much time have I got to get there? And that app works really well for being able to include all those factors. Now let's take my general recommendations for visiting cities within the United States. There's basically 3 types of American cities. Number 1 is it's a highly car-dependent city. You really can't manage in that city without having a car or somebody to drive you around. But it is also probably going to be a very large, spread out city that to use just taxis, Lyft, or Uber would cost a fortune. Okay, and so in cities like this, and examples I can think of off the top of my head would be Los Angeles or Atlanta. Okay, for 2 examples. They're very car dependent, and you really, if you're visiting those cities, you either want to have driven there yourself or you want to rent a car. I mean, I'm not saying you can't visit these cities without having a car, but you really probably are going to need a car. Okay, so that's one set of cities in the United States. Cities that tend to be very large, spread out, take up a large area in miles, and don't have a really advanced, thorough public transportation infrastructure. They might have some public transportation, but like it'll only cover like certain areas, for example, you know, like just downtown or whatever. The other type of city that is pretty car dependent is smaller cities. Smaller cities that have no public transportation infrastructure. So for example, you know, a lot of cities in the Midwest or the South might not have really anything for public transportation. Maybe they have like a bus, but it's a really infrequent, you know, not very, you know, they only have 5 buses or something, you know, it's not really very developed. And they might not even really have any taxis or rideshare services available. So if you're in some smaller American cities, this is a very distinct possibility. And that would be the other city that I would say is car dependent. The other type of city is if it's a small city that doesn't have public transportation or rideshare or taxi services readily available. And then you're going to want, again, going to want to have a car. You're going to either want to have driven there yourself, or if you can, rented a car. I'll give you an example. Where we live, you can't get around here without a car. There is there's no taxis. There's private people driving around like minivans that they have stuck letters on the side that say it's a taxi service with a phone number slapped on it, but it's not like an official taxi service. There is a little bit of Uber and Lyft, but like the one time I had a flat tire and I tried to see if I could get like a Lyft or something, it was going to take like 2.5 hours before they were going to come pick me up. You can rent a car at our little tiny airport that has 2-3 flights a day. Used it maybe once or twice in my life. Okay. You can rent a car there. There are, I think there's 3-4 rental car agencies there. And I have rented a car there when I've needed a car while my car was getting fixed. So you can do that. You can rent a car in most small cities that you're going to need a car for if you fly in. So if they've got an airport, they probably have a way to rent a car. The second category of city is one where it's kind of a mix. So some of the time you might want to drive, but some of the time you might be able to just use a taxi or a rideshare or walk or use public transportation. So it's kind of a mixed thing. So for example, when the person was asking me about Seattle, that was kind of a mixed city. We flew there, but the hotel that we stayed at before our cruise was a long way from the cruise port. So that's one example right up front. The hotel that we stayed at was near the airport. If you're staying at a hotel near the airport, chances are your hotel is going to have a complimentary shuttle van or shuttle bus that picks people up at the airport. Now, you might have to call them to come get you and let them know that you've arrived. But, you know, that you'll be able to get to your hotel. And then, like, I'll give you an example. That night, we wanted to go have dinner. And so we asked at the front desk, hey, are there some restaurants around? And I think I looked at Google Maps, and there was a Denny's walking distance away, okay? So we walked from our hotel to the Denny's and ate. When we were done eating, we wanted to do two things. We needed to go to a store because we'd forgotten a couple things. So we wanted to get to Target. And we also were bored because we had a long time until we were going to go to bed, different time zones, stuff like that. We decided to go to a movie. I remember we went to the live action Little Mermaid, okay? And so to get from the Denny's where we were, that was near our hotel by the airport, to get to where there was a Target next to a mall that had a movie theater in it, okay, so we could walk from the Target to the mall. They were right across the street from each other. The best option there was to get a rideshare. So I ordered a Lyft. The guy was there in a couple of minutes. He drove us to the Target. We did our shopping at the Target. We walked over to the mall. We went to the movie. And then I ordered another Lyft to take us back to our hotel. So that was an example of how I used a combination of transportation methods to get around there. We paid for a shuttle service that took us and a whole bunch of other cruise passengers from our hotel all the way downtown Seattle to the cruise port the next day to get to our ship, because there really wasn't any other way to get there without a car. And I don't think the parking options, if you drove yourself to the cruise port in Seattle, were great. So that's something to consider too if you're taking a cruise. Some cities are better than others at providing parking for cruises. Like, for example, if you're cruising out of Port Canaveral in Florida, there's lots of options that are reasonable cost for you to be able to park your own car or a rental car, either right at the cruise port or in an off-site lot with a free shuttle. I've done that. Works fine. Okay. New York City, not so much. Seattle, not so much if you're cruising out of one of those. Even San Diego, the ships they're right there when you're walking down the sidewalk in the city, but where you're going to leave your car, not so great. Okay. So you need to research that too. If you're driving to a cruise port, can I park there? You know, do I want to have a car for this? Because that can be an important deciding factor too. When we got off the cruise in Seattle and then we're going around, we used a combination of our feet, because we were very close walking distance to a lot of attractions, and public transportation. My dad and my son used the monorail and then another train to get back to the airport. They were able to get from our hotel in downtown Seattle all the way back to the airport by some form of train thing. We also used their Lyft to get to a different part of downtown Seattle on a different day that we could not walk to. And that brings me to my other big recommendation for you, which is when you're exploring any city, try to organize your days there geographically. When we were in Seattle, also when we were in London, I say, okay, we're going to go to these 3 things today because they're all close together in this area. And then you just have to get to that area and then you can walk from one thing to the other. Okay, so that's a really good way to explore a city. Say there's like 4 areas that you want to explore that have multiple things that you want to see and do in them. Don't, you know, go here and then go way over there and then go back over here. That's very inefficient. Organize the city geographically into geographic areas and then tackle those one day at a time. Or, you know, one section in the morning and then we're going to go over here in the afternoon or whatever it is. So be smart about how you divide up the city. You know, don't try to do the Statue of Liberty and the cloisters in New York City on the same day. Okay, those two things are about as far apart as you could possibly be from each other in New York City. One's all the way as far north as you can get, north of Harlem, and the Statue of Liberty is off the southern tip of Manhattan. So that would make no sense at all. They're nowhere near each other. Okay, so do your stuff down in the Battery Park area and near where you get the ferry for the boats for Statue of Liberty. National Park Service, actually. And, you know, do that stuff down there. You know, maybe the Tenement Museum, other things, you know, the 9/11 Memorial, all of that's down at the bottom of Manhattan. Do that stuff on one day. Do stuff, museums, theater, the Met, Midtown area. Do that stuff a different day, okay? Like that. So divide up your city geographically into regions and tackle a section at a time. That's really, I think, the best way to explore a city, and the most efficient and going to be the least exhausting. Because then you only have to get to this general area, and then you're going to be within that general area for the whole day. So there were cities where I said that you are car dependent. And then there are cities where there's kind of a mix, which I talked about. And then the third type of city is you absolutely should not have a car. You have no business trying to drive around that city. Don't take your car. And I mean, I have actually been to cities like that and have had a car or my car or rental car or whatever, but regretted it. When I try to drive in cities that you really shouldn't be trying to get around in a car, Boston's one of them, New York is one of them, Washington, D.C., nobody has a business driving around Washington, D.C., San Francisco, you know, there's so much public transportation in San Francisco. Places like that where you really should, Chicago, I hate having a car in Chicago. I hate driving to Chicago. Where you really have no business having a car. You can totally, very easily get around on public transportation, and you should. So in that situation, you have two options. One is get there on a plane or on a train or however you get there and don't ever have a car at all. Okay, and just use public transportation to get around or walk or whatever. That doesn't mean you can never take a taxi or never use a Lyft or Uber, but you probably won't need to use it very much. For example, one day we were in London. It was ungodly hot out. We were very tired. We had gone to Tate Modern, didn't really like it, decided we wanted to do something else. We could have walked or taken the tube, which the distance to the tube was ways. It was really, really hot. We were like, screw this. I hailed a taxi. Okay. And I'm like, can you take us to Museum of London, which is on the other side of the river? Sure, no problem. Taxis in London are all electric. They're all very nicely air conditioned. It was heaven to be in the taxi for that 5-10 minutes we were in the taxi. Okay. That was worth it to me. When we were in Seattle, we walked to Shake Shack from our hotel the last night that my dad and Andrew were there, because Andrew had gone out to dinner with a friend of his from college that lives in Seattle. So me, my dad, and the kids, the other two kids, needed someplace to go. So we walked to Shake Shack. We very easily walked to the Shake Shack. But my ankles started bothering me on the walk. It was a pretty decent walk. And so because we were tired and it was late, my ankle was bothering me, I ordered a Lyft and we took the Lyft back to the hotel. So it's not like it's the end of the world if you never have to use a taxi or a Lyft or an Uber. But I'm just saying there's times when you should be able to get around mostly by public transportation or walking. But once in a while, you know, in circumstances like that, it's late. You don't necessarily feel safe walking. Maybe the subways have already stopped for the night or something. It's raining. It's really, really hot. You're terribly tired. Something like that. Don't feel guilty if occasionally you have to do something like that. Okay, so if you're in a city where you really have no business driving around, but maybe you drove yourself to the city, or maybe you're going to also be visiting something else that's outside the city later that you need a car to get to, okay? You got a couple options here, and I'm going to give you some real life examples. So, for example, one time we went to Boston. We flew there, okay? My kids were little. Ben wasn't even born yet. Megan was 2. Andrew was like 9. It was me, my husband, my dad, and my 2 kids, and they were small. While we were in Boston, we flew to Boston, we used public transportation. We were at a hotel on the Blue Line, and we would take the Blue Line into the city, and we would get around the city in Boston on foot and using public transportation, and that worked fine. But at the end of our trip, we wanted to go to Nantucket. And so then we rented a car at that point only. When we were about to go out of the city, I think we went back to the airport, rented the car, went to Nantucket, did that, went to Cape Cod and stuff, and then drove back to the airport, turned the car in, and flew home. Another time I remember that we did that, very similar thing. And again, it was same thing. It was me, my dad, and my husband, and the 2 older kids who were at the time very small. And this time we took Amtrak. We took Amtrak from where we live to Washington, D.C. This was summer of 2004. I remember distinctly. And we did not get a car. We got the train, took a taxi probably, I'm thinking, to our hotel, got around Washington, D.C. completely on foot and using public transportation. But then after we were done exploring Washington, D.C., we wanted to visit the historic Triangle in Virginia, which is Colonial Williamsburg, Jamestown, and Yorktown. At that point, went back to the train station, the Amtrak station, Union Station in Washington, D.C., rented a car from there, drove to Virginia, to the historic Triangle, visited those places over several days, then drove back to the train station, returned our rental car, got on our Amtrak train, and went home. That's a really good way to do it. If you're trying to combine a city and something near the city that you can't get to on public transportation, that's a good way to do it. Save that more relaxing part. Do the city first, because that's intense. You can flip it around if you want to. And then wait and get the car that you need to get to the other place at the end. And then when you come back from that to get the transportation, the train or the plane back home, drop off the car and go like you normally would. So that's a really good way to do it. The other thing I would recommend, going back to Washington, D.C. again, we took a big trip in the summer of 2021, I think it was. We flew to Baltimore, and on that trip, we visited Baltimore, Washington, D.C., the historic Triangle, and went all the way to North Carolina to the Outer Banks, which, by the way, was too much to do in one trip. But so it did involve the need for a car to cover all that distance, and it was a lot of driving, more than I liked. When we got to the cities, the different cities to Baltimore, you know, when we were doing the Baltimore part, which actually was at the end, except for the flight there, and the Washington, D.C. part, basically what I did while we were in the cities is I parked the car somewhere secure. For us in Washington, D.C., it was in the underground parking at the Hilton where we were staying, and I left it there. So, you know, if you've got a car, but you're going to a city where the public transportation is good, ditch the car, put it in an underground secured parking ramp or whatever, and then go explore the city on foot and using public transportation, and don't use the car again until you got to leave to either go home or go to the next place. So that's my recommendation, what you can do in that situation. So there you go. This is a very long video with a lot of information for you. I will definitely put chapters down at the bottom here for you so you can skip to the parts that apply to you. But these are my recommendations and my tips for how to get around big cities. So again, there's 3 types of cities in the United States. Car dependent, somewhat car dependent with a mix of good ways to get around, and totally don't take a car there or drive a car around that city. What are you thinking? Again, I've been to almost every major city in the United States. If you have a specific city that you have in mind that you want to know what's the best way to get around in this city, please leave it in the comments below and I will answer that for you. I really hope this video was helpful to you. This is a common part of travel that I really think a lot of people neglect to think about. You know, both that thing about like when I get there, when I get to the city, now what do I do? That's a step that I think a lot of people miss in their planning. What do I do once I land at the airport? Or what do I do once I get to the train station? Now what do I do? You know, they don't think about that part of it. And then they either don't know because they're not familiar enough with the city that they're visiting. What are the best ways to get around this place? Or they don't research enough ahead of time to realize, oh, I really didn't need to rent a car here. Or, oh, I used taxi and Lyft that whole time and there was this subway stop a block from my hotel. I could have been taking that the whole time, you know, or something like that. So this is a really important aspect of planning a trip to a city that you need to consider, because it can be the difference of hundreds or thousands of dollars in how much transportation costs you that you have to factor in for your budget for your trip. And that's another thing too. People often don't factor in the cost of transportation when they budget for their trip. So that's something that you really need to know. How much is it going to cost me to get around when we're there? You know, and even when you rent a car, I don't think people often remember to factor in, it's not just the cost of the car rental. You also need to factor in the cost of parking in a lot of, you know, instances, and gas, because you're going to be driving that car around and using fuel. Is how much is transportation at the destination going to cost me? You know, you might have figured out how much the plane ticket to get me there cost me, but you completely forget about that whole other budget category of transportation in the place. So how you get around a city can really make a difference in how much your total trip costs you. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I really hope it was helpful. If it was, please give me a thumbs up. And again, make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you haven't already. Have a great day, everyone, and safe travels.